night of December 15, 1900, a steamship named SS Arthur passing through the North Atlantic saw something that should not have happened. A lighthouse with its light extinguished. Something extremely dangerous for any ship passing through that area. The lighthouse stood on a remote rocky island group called Flannan Isles, 32 kilometers off the west coast of Scotland. There were 3 men who were supposed to be on duty at that tower, responsible for keeping the light burning. But that night the sea saw a dark tower. The captain, of course, reported the incident to the Northern Lighthouse Board on the mainland. However, the relief vessel Hesperus could not depart anytime soon. Winter weather closed the sea for several days. Only on December 26, 1900 was Hesperus finally able to sail to Flannan Isles, carrying a replacement keeper named Joseph Moore. As Hesperus approached East Landing, its captain, Jim Harvey, sounded a long horn 3 times and lit a signal flare as a sign of arrival. Normally, the 3 keepers would already be waiting at the landing rocks, but this time no one greeted them. The 3 keepers who were supposed to be there were James Ducat, Thomas Marshall, and Donald MacArthur. They were scheduled to work in shifts and never left their post without a replacement. Because there was no answer from shore, Joseph Moore was sent ashore to climb to the tower. He climbed the steep path toward the building, calling the names of his colleagues. However, there was no answer. Inside the tower, he found the main door locked from the inside. When he forced his way in, the first thing he saw was the lighthouse lamp in a clean and ready-to-use condition, the oil tank filled, and the lamp wick already trimmed. This meant that the men had indeed still been working a few days earlier. Moving to the dining room, he found an overturned chair. On a rack near the door, 2 heavy cold weather jackets were still hanging, even though there was a winter storm in the Atlantic at the time, which meant that whoever went outside would certainly have worn those jackets. Moore returned to the ship and reported to Harvey. They went back up to the island with several crew members for a wider search, yet there was still no trace of the 3 keepers, neither inside the lighthouse nor anywhere else on the island. It was as if they had simply vanished. An examination of the log showed that the keepers were still writing entries until 9:00 in the morning on December 15th. The entry dated December 12th recorded a very violent storm. Thomas Marshall wrote that he felt the strongest winds of his entire career. He also wrote about changes in the behavior of his colleagues. James was described as gloomy and quiet. Donald was said to be crying and appeared frightened. They wrote that they prayed together. On December 15th, the final entry stated that the storm had passed and the sea had become calm again. After that, there was no more writing. The problem was that weather records from ships passing through the area showed that between December 12th and 14, there had been no major storm. Winds were recorded within normal winter limits with no reports of extreme waves or weather warnings. This is where questions began to emerge. If there was no storm, what were they writing about? If the sea was not raging, what made those 3 experienced men write about fear, tears, and prayers? Various theories then began to develop. One of the keepers may have gone out to secure equipment as waves rose. The other 2 tried to help and were swept away as well. 3 experienced men in open waters carried away before they had a chance to avoid it. And currents in that region usually brought objects back to shore, yet their bodies were never found. Perhaps they fled or abandoned their post without permission, but where could they go? Without a boat and without jackets on a rocky island in the middle of the winter sea. Meanwhile, they were known as hard-working, responsible men with families waiting for their return. The darkest version is a quarrel among the keepers, an abduction, an attack by a sea creature, or something not recorded in their reports. Not a single theory can explain everything at once. Why was the door locked from the inside? Why was not a single body ever found? And why did they write about something that never existed? What is certain is that they disappeared without a trace and never returned. The thing most often discussed is the state of their own minds. Notes about fear, crying, and prayer point toward mental pressure. 3 men living in a cramped place far from anyone. In conditions like that, one fear can spread to 2 other people. If one person begins to panic, the other 2 can be pulled along. Here the question shifts. What happened inside their heads before that? Did they see something that existed only in their minds? Did they become suspicious of one another? Did they believe danger was coming even though the world outside continued as normal? Flannan Isles became one of the defining points in the reputation of lighthouse keepers as people vulnerable to mental collapse. To understand how they could reach that point, we must step back and understand why this job from the very beginning placed human beings at the edge of sanity. In the 18th and 19th centuries, approaching land did not mean safety. In fact, that was where most ships were destroyed. At that time, sea charts were still crude. At night or when fog descended, a ship could sail straight toward land without knowing that ahead of it there were only rocks and waves left. In many regions of Europe, especially England, France, and Scandinavia, reports of shipwrecks always mentioned the same pattern. The ship had already seen land and then disappeared a few hours later. This happened because currents pushed ships onto reefs before the crew had time to change course. They did not sink in the open sea, but rather broke apart when approaching the coast. Reefs worked like saws. When a ship struck them, the thick wooden hull could be torn apart within seconds. After that, the waves finished the rest. A great tragedy that showed how fragile human beings were at sea. One of the most well-known was Lemedius in 1816, a French warship that ran aground on a sandbank near the coast of West Africa due to poor navigation. Hundreds of people became trapped on an emergency raft built in haste. For nearly 2 weeks they drifted without food or water. Some died of thirst, some drowned, some were killed and eaten by other starving passengers. When the raft was found, only a handful were still alive. Throughout the 18th and 19th centuries, thousands of merchant ships and passenger ships were lost, not because of battles with great storms, but because they misread the coastline. These events opened Europe's eyes to the fact that navigation errors near land could become disasters more cruel than storms. This is where lighthouses began to be treated as tools of survival, built in places most hostile to human beings. From the edges of reefs, remote islands, to headlands continuously struck by waves. Their towers had to be visible from far away, and their lights had to remain lit without interruption even during storms. If the light went out, the safe route would disappear. Behind this light were people who rarely entered history books, namely the keepers who came from different backgrounds, and often from groups living on the margins of society. In the United States during the 19th century, many lighthouses were kept by women. When their husbands died or were transferred, the service often appointed their wives as replacements because they were considered already familiar with the routine. There they worked full-time, lifting oil, cleaning lenses, recording weather, and keeping the light alive. Their wages were usually lower than those of male keepers. In Coast Guard reports, their names were listed as assistants even though their responsibilities were equal. There were also keepers from among Chinese laborers on the Pacific coast. They were recruited because they were considered accustomed to heavy physical work and low wages. They lived in towers far from everything, facing the sea and fog without any social network around them. Language and culture separated them from mainland communities. Former slaves also entered this profession after the American Civil War. For them, the lighthouse became the only stable job available. However, this stability was paid for with isolation, discrimination in the form of low wages, and in some cases they were assigned to lighthouses that were extremely difficult to reach with building conditions that could be considered poor. One name that appears in the archives is Venus Parker. She was recorded as a keeper at Florida Case in the late 19th century. She worked in a structure located in a storm-prone region and lived on a small island with limited supplies. Her duty records were neat. However, her personal letters revealed a long loneliness. She wrote about days filled with the sounds of wind and sea, with no visitors other than supply ships that rarely arrived. The moral burden fell entirely on lighthouse keepers. They carried a very heavy social function. If a ship wrecked near their area, the first questions would always be the same. Was the light on? Was the keeper negligent? Did he fall asleep? That is why the keeper system was strict. Work schedules were long and severe punishments existed for negligence. In some regions, a keeper proven to have allowed the light to go out could be dismissed immediately and branded as the cause of other people's deaths. In the maritime world, a reputation like that was equivalent to social exile. This pressure was worsened by their work locations. Usually reaching them required a ship dependent on the weather. During winter, keepers could be isolated for weeks. They lived with limited supplies, rigid routines, and the sound of waves constantly filling their hearing. Inside the tower, 3 or 2 people had to live together in a single confined space. They shared a kitchen, shared watch shifts, and shared the same air every day. Differences in habits could easily become sources of conflict. Some wanted to sleep longer, some were overly meticulous about cleanliness, and some became angry quickly when schedules were disrupted. In reports from the Northern Lighthouse Board, small conflicts were often recorded as workplace tensions. Their contents revolved around arguments over duties and rest periods. There are also records of violence in lighthouse history. In Wells during the 1800s, one keeper struck another because he felt that he had deliberately interfered with his watch schedule. In the United States, one keeper once locked his colleague in a storage room for several hours after an argument over night duties. These incidents show that pressure could emerge in physical forms. Some strictly prohibited alcohol. This rule was created because one mistake could have fatal consequences for ships at sea. However, that prohibition also meant that keepers had no simple escape from routine. Long nights were spent reading or writing. Some of them kept personal journals in addition to official logs. From these writings, loneliness often appeared as the main theme. In situations like this, the mind can easily change. When the sound of waves and wind become the only sounds, the imagination begins searching for patterns. A shadow outside the window can feel like movement. The sound of metal expanding in the cold can resemble footsteps. Some medical reports mention the term lighthouse madness as a way of explaining sleep disorders, anxiety, and behavioral changes among keepers who spent long periods serving in isolated places. Off the coast of Wales stood a stone tower on a small reef called Small Lighthouse. In 1801, this lighthouse was tended by 2 men with the same first name, Thomas Howell and Thomas Gliffet. They were sent there for the duty already mentioned earlier, in waters known to be dangerous for ships passing toward Ireland. The rocky island on which the lighthouse stood offered almost no room for living. The only access was a small boat that could approach only when the sea was calm. One day during winter, Griffiths fell ill. Records mention a high fever and a weakening condition. Howell cared for him as best he could with the limited medical supplies available in the tower. The supply ship was not scheduled to arrive for several more weeks. Inside that tower, Griffiths eventually died. The next problem was what to do afterward. On the mainland, a body could be buried immediately. At Small Lighthouse, there was no soil and no place to dig a grave. Lowering the body into the sea carried the risk of it being discovered by a ship or washed back onto the rocks. At that point, Howell decided to keep his friend's body inside a makeshift coffin. The coffin was placed in one of the tower's rooms, and Howell continued carrying out his duties. He passed the coffin again and again. At night, he slept only a few meters away from the lifeless body. Days turned into weeks. Bad weather delayed the supply ship. Westerly winds brought high waves that battered the tower without pause. Howell, living alone in the cramped space with the corpse of his co-worker, began to smell an odor even though the coffin remained tightly sealed. At times, the sound of wood expanding and contracting in the cold resembled knocking. In a letter written later, Howell admitted that he began to feel that the coffin was moving. Not because it was actually moving, but because his mind had started interpreting every sound as something else. This condition lasted for weeks. When the ship finally arrived, the crew found Howell in a state of extreme weakness and confusion. He survived, but he never returned to work at a lighthouse. Medical reports stated that he suffered a severe nervous disorder after the incident. If we connect this to Flannan Isles, the case of Small Lighthouse provides an illustration of how pressure inside a tower could become very real fear. In many lighthouses, to make the lenses rotate smoothly, engineers placed the entire lens system on top of a basin filled with liquid mercury. This metal was heavy and slippery, allowing giant lenses to float and rotate with minimal force. From an engineering perspective, this was certainly a clever solution, but from a health perspective, it was a disaster that was not yet understood at the time. The keepers dealt directly with this system every day. They cleaned the glass and sometimes opened the mercury basin during maintenance. Without special gloves or masks, mercury vapor in the enclosed space slowly entered their lungs. The effects did not appear immediately. Early symptoms often included headaches and sleep disturbances. After that came behavioral changes, increased suspicion, quick tempers, and difficulty concentrating. In medical records, this condition is known as erethism, a term for a nervous disorder caused by mercury. People who experience it can appear restless, easily irritated, and sometimes speak in a disorganized manner. In several locations, its effects were documented clearly. One example was on Flannan Island, a lighthouse off the western coast of Australia. The keepers complained of dizziness and changes in mood. An investigation later found high levels of mercury in the lens room. The system was replaced, but the symptoms in some keepers persisted for a long time. A more extreme case occurred at Lead Light. This lighthouse stood on rocks that were constantly battered by waves. One keeper was reported to have experienced delusions and eventually ended his own life. His colleague also showed signs of severe paranoia before being removed from duty. Some cases mention keepers who suddenly became convinced that their coworkers intended to harm them. In one report, a keeper locked the door to the engine room because he felt he was being watched. In Canada, at Langara Point Lighthouse, internal reports stated that several keepers experienced sudden aggression and memory problems. After investigation, the source was the same: mercury exposure from the lens rotation system. Mercury also affected the body. Hands could tremble, movements became clumsy, and writing ability declined. If a keeper recorded entries in the logbook, their handwriting could change shape from day to day. This provides a new context for the Flannan Isles records filled with anxiety and extreme descriptions of weather. It is possible that the writer's mind was already in a condition disturbed by an invisible poison. As medical science began to advance in the early 20th century, the connection between mercury and nervous disorders started to be understood. Many lighthouses replaced mercury-bearing systems with other mechanisms. However, the reputation of the mad lighthouse keeper had already been formed. Stories about strange behavior spread long before their scientific explanation. Behind stories of panicked prayers, fear without cause, and conflicts among keepers, there was a chemical factor working slowly, damaging them from within and affecting the way they thought and felt. So if we combine it with isolation, heavy routines, and great responsibility, mercury becomes an additional layer that worsened the situation. This is enough to explain why some keepers change their behavior without any clear reason. When we read strange entries in logbooks or hear stories about keepers whose behavior changed, we need to remember who wrote them. They were people living far from the center of attention, carrying the lives of others on their shoulders, and enduring all of it alone with their thoughts while their bodies were being poisoned by technology that was supposed to save lives at sea. The mystery remains, but the lesson is clear. Before the sea swallows someone, it is often their mind that sinks first. If there is one thing that can be taken home from this story, it is the awareness that the jobs we may complain about today still often give us the opportunity to return home and meet the people we love. Being grateful for work does not mean ignoring exhaustion or stress, but recognizing that we still have room to share, to complain safely, and to improve our circumstances. It may not shine as brightly as a lighthouse, but it still has meaning, namely protecting our own lives and the lives of the people around us. And that is enough to be grateful for.